Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here as always with Dr. Tyler McNabb. And today we have a really special episode because we have two professional philosophers come on to school Tyler and I about Pascal's wager. And so we have Megan Fritts. Megan is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Utah State and is a PhD candidate and researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Megan specializes in action and value theory. And we also have Dr. Liz Jackson, Professor of Philosophy at Ryerson. Liz received her PhD at Notre Dame and specializes in philosophy of religion and epistemology. And so, Megan and Liz, thank you both so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate you all being here.
Thanks, Mike. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I'm excited too.
Of course. So today you're going to, like I said at the beginning, talk us through Pascal's wager. I know both of you have really interesting takes and have done a lot of work on it. And so I know Tyler and I are excited. Tyler, you want to start off and ask the opening question?
Yeah, so we'll get into that. Liz, tell us, what's Pascal's wager? What's it all about?
Yeah, for sure. So I like to kind of explain Pascal's wager by contrasting it with what I think most theistic arguments are doing. So most theistic arguments are for the conclusion that God exists, like the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, they conclude God exists, or, a specific kind of God exists, something like that. Pascal's wager is importantly different because the conclusion isn't that God exists, but the conclusion is that you should believe in God. And basically what Pascal's wager appeals to is sort of the risk-reward trade-off. And so the thought is, well, look, if you believe in God and God exists, you have a lot to gain, potentially infinite to gain if you go to heaven. If you believe in God and God does not exist, then what you gain or lose would be finite. If you don't believe in God and God exists and there's hell, that could be an infinite loss. Maybe even if you're just annihilated, the wager could still go through as well. And then if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, you do gain a true belief, but again, what you gain or lose would be finite. So at least the traditional version of the wager it kind of plays off the difference between infinite and finite values and basically says, these infinite values trump these finite values. And so given the risk-reward trade-off, you have a reason to believe in God, you should believe in God. There's a lot of different versions of the wager, though, and not all of them necessarily rely on infinities. I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more, especially when I think we're going to talk about a paper that I have. But I can also mention when we talk there about some of the versions of the wager that are don't necessarily appeal to infinite utility. But yeah, that's the basic version.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. Megan, I know that you have thought about the wager in your own personal life, kind of thinking through it about your own faith. Can you kind of take us through some of the steps that you've made in reference to thinking about this more practically speaking?
Yeah, so Pascal's wager is kind of an argument that was made for someone like me. And by someone like me, I mean someone who thinks that you can't come to, or I shouldn't say think, someone who suspects maybe you can't come to the belief that God exists through evidence. I mean, he starts out the section of the Pensées by saying that evidence and reason can't get us to any notion of the probability of God's existence. It's not even that, he thinks that it's really improbable that God exists, and so, but we should believe anyway, which I've heard the wager taught this way before. That's not what he says. He doesn't say, well, there's a small chance God doesn't exist, but we should believe anyway. He really thinks that there's nothing that can, through reason alone, get us to God exists or God doesn't exist, even just a probability judgment there. So I have always thought this. I mean, when I was younger, of course, I tried thinking through all these arguments, and I kind of had the same experience with, for every really good argument for God's existence, I can read a really good argument against God's existence, and then knowing how many more arguments are out there that I'll never read, how many possible arguments there are out there, it kind of feels like dizzying, all the different arguments that are made and could be made, and so it felt like that was kind of out of reach. So Pascal recognizes this, and he kind of says, but look, I'm going to give you something to do instead. And how he starts out the wager, he doesn't begin by telling people to believe. His first advice is to start doing what believers do. Start taking the holy water and going to mass and engaging in prayer. So it starts out very, very practically. He expects that he says, we need to start doing this, and then belief will follow. So as someone who thinks very much that our practical life is prior to our mental life, that always seemed really promising to me.
Yeah, so it sounds like someone also needs to be a reformed epistemologist. Am I right, Liz? No.
There you go.
No. So kind of more about that. Was there a time period where you thought, actually, I'm not so certain about these things. I'm just going to go ahead and commit to Christianity anyway because of this reasoning? Was there a particular time, or did it sort of just naturally happen over a long period of time?
Sorry, was that at me or Liz?
Yeah, sorry, that was at you. So I'm asking, like, was there almost like a good Baptist moment, like, right, where all of a sudden you were like, I'm going to commit to Christianity because of this wager, or did it sort of just slowly develop over time and you just kind of realized, yeah, that's what I'm doing?
I'm sure there was a moment. I couldn't tell you when it was, but it really was a very overt decision. Kind of being at this place where I really felt like I couldn't know through evidence, through argumentation, and being sort of aware that maybe I do think it's true that a non-theistic worldview is probably the default for people living now in our time, for a lot of reasons that I think Charles Taylor actually lays out really brilliantly in his book on the history of secularization. But I was aware of that as well, so I didn't even really trust my intuitions or plausibility judgments on this. So my thought process was basically, it was pretty Pascalian. It was, well, what would be the best if it were true? What's the kind of thing that I could devote my life to and not regret it? And Christianity was the answer to that.
Oh, very good. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, here's one last question for me, and then I'll throw it to Mike. And it's kind of for both of you. So if you want to just kind of take this in turn, what's sort of the best objection or an objection that's popular that you think should be addressed regarding Pascal's wager, and how do you respond to that objection?
I can go first. Yeah. So I always hear the objection that Pascal's wager doesn't account for there being so many different possible gods. The sometimes called the Many-gods Objection. Well, how can this wager is not going to work if there's 50 different religions all positing a heaven and a hell, but all putting forward a really different kind of God, and so then which one do I wager on? See, the utility functions in that case can't really give me an answer. I think this works as an objection if you teach the wager purely on its own as a decision matrix. And so, which is why if I ever teach it, I tend to not do that, because throughout the Pances, which is a really, really excellent work, like just as a whole, it's really beautiful. He spends much of the book arguing for this particular conception of God, the God that he had this really vivid religious experience of himself, and arguing against some sort of other conceptions of God, the God of the philosophers, that kind of thing. So it's a decent objection, I suppose, to a standalone teaching of just the wager as a decision matrix, but Pascal had a response to it.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that first and say, so Megan's great on the historical stuff, and I know a little bit about that, but my main thing is kind of more contemporary discussions of the wager, and those as well. I think the Many-gods Objection is something that's thrown out a lot. Actually, even if you just, like Megan said, if you just showed this matrix like to your Philosophy 101 class, everyone's like, what about all the religions, blah, 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 like very common thing that people bring up. But what I think is important to note about the Many-gods objection is that in the ultimately successful version of Pascal's wager, the probability of each religion is going to matter. So it's not just going to be like all religions are equal and the like 0.0001 probable, like maybe, Greek god's religion is going to be just, we have just as much reason to wager on that as we have to wager on a religion that we think is 50, 60, 70% likely to be true. And I think once we kind of get that, once we see that, it's like clearly you should go for the one you think is more probable rather than less probable, then the Many-gods objection kind of drops out, because you should go for the religion that you take to be most probable. And then there's different ways you can go with this. So one way you can go with this is just leave it up to each individual person and say, I'm not going to tell you what religion that is, but whichever religion it is, you should practice it. And for most people, atheism and agnosticism are going to be irrational, at least as like a lifestyle or something. But then the other way you can go with it is kind of more like what Megan was describing that Pascal did, where you actually then give arguments for a particular religion. And so you say you should wager on the religion you take to be most likely to be true, premise one, and then premise two, whatever religion is most likely to be true. And I think, maybe Christianity would at least be the one that I would pick, So then you could get the conclusion that you should wager on Christianity. And so that kind of solves the Many-gods objection. I don't know if you guys want to keep talking about this. I actually have a different objection I was going to mention.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick, and then perhaps then you can go to the other objection.
Yeah.
Whenever I teach this to my students, I give an example where I say, imagine instead of an infinite reward in heaven, we're talking about like I don't know, like $1 billion or something. And the $1 billion is in one of these boxes. Obviously, there's certain boxes that are like really, really small that it's just not going to likely fit $1 billion in, right? And then maybe you might have gigantic boxes that are just way too big, right? And maybe, I don't know, you lift them up and they're super lightweight or something. So there's like a process of elimination that you can sort of do. And I take it that's what you're sort of suggesting, is that once you sort of calculate, do your evidentials and stuff, right? Figure out which religious traditions are less plausible, right? Which one has more probability overall, then you sort of apply Pascal's wager. That's roughly what you're advocating for, right? Just to clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. So at least in my view, the version of the wager that's going to be ultimately successful will have an epistemic component. That's not the only thing that's doing work, but it is part of what's doing work. So it's a little bit, you could say that it's weaker than a version of Pascal's wager that just says the probability doesn't matter at all, like just wager for God. But then I think that's the kind of wager that's going to be susceptible to the Many-gods stuff. So you do need to bring in the epistemic stuff to kind of adjudicate between different religions. So I totally agree.
Okay,
yeah.
Very good. Well, go ahead and tell us about the other objection you have in mind.
The second objection is, I think, another one that a lot of people bring up kind of when they're initially confronted with the wager, and there's sort of two different aspects to it. So it has to do with the nature of belief. And I think, and Megan's version of this might be slightly different too. So I'm not going to say this automatically applies to what Megan was talking about. But when you just say, you should believe in God or you should believe in Christianity because of the risk-reward trade-off, I think a lot of people bring up this kind of two-part thing, which is first of all, I can't do that. I can't control my beliefs. I can't just make myself believe in God. And then second of all, even if I could, that would be irrational. It would be like believing something because you gave me money to do so or something. That doesn't seem like a great reason for belief, So I think this is an important objection because, I think a lot of people just initially bring this up to Pascal's wager. And I guess a couple things to say about this. And Megan kind of already anticipated this, like I said in some of her comments. But one thing I think is interesting is if we are in a situation where you see reason can't decide is one way of putting it, or our evidence kind of leaves the question open. That's kind of the way I like to put it, but I think you can put it either way. Then it's not at all obvious that either of these objections are going to be successful. First of all, what's really interesting is you might say I'll give you $1 million to believe 1 + 1 = 3. Well, that's obviously false. So I can't do that when we're talking about whether you can just believe it all. But when we're talking about something that you're really torn about and is like more of a genuine choice, I think it's a lot less obvious that you can't exert at least some level of control over those kind of beliefs. So take, like controversial issues in philosophy, or maybe you've been like really torn about gun control lately or something. When you consider a more controversial topic, I think it's a lot less clear that we don't have some level of control over our beliefs. But then the second thing that's I think is really interesting too is if we are in this evidential situation where the evidence kind of leaves open, different religions or theism and atheism, then it's also not at all obvious that committing to one for practical reasons would be irrational, because in a way there's kind of good arguments for both. So the way that you would put it in epistemology terms is you're in an epistemically permissive case. You could kind of commit to either one or believe either one and not be irrational. And then the final thing to say about this kind of beliefy objection is that if you frame the wager in terms of a way of acting and a lifestyle and not in terms of what you believe, then both of these objections actually totally drop out, because now we're talking about the rationality of action, and it doesn't matter if you can't control your beliefs, and it doesn't matter if believing in God would be irrational given your evidence, because it's just about action. So another way you can kind of sidestep the objections too is just by making an action-y wager rather than a beliefy wager. So
yeah, that's really helpful. And so you look at it as more of motivation to try to indirectly control your beliefs, right? So if you want to believe in Christianity because you think that's the way to go, then to quote Ice Cube, go to church, right? I mean that's kind of the idea, I think. Mike, do you want to go ahead and take it over from here?
Yeah, I don't have any Ice Cube quotes, but Liz, Tyler and I wrote a paper on applying Pascal's wager to the climate change debate. And the one thing I noticed with decision theory more broadly, and obviously with Pascal's wager, is the problem, some of the objections that come along when you're plugging in infinite utilities and disutilities. And so one paper that I relied on for help was the paper that you wrote for Philosophia Christi, I believe, called Salvaging Pascal's Wager. And so I was wondering if maybe you could take us through sort of the objection for using infinite utilities and disutilities in a decision matrix, and then how you went about handling that objection.
Yeah, for sure. So infinities are weird in general. I think most people who've thought about infinity even a little bit could kind of see that. But they're weird. So they're weird in decision making. So what decision theory is it's just basically a way that it's a model we can use to make decisions, and you can use it for basically any decision. But decision theory gets weird when you start having, infinities involved. And actually one way to see this is actually to go back to the Many-gods Objection. So the way you calculate how you should act in decision theory, you take how good an outcome would be and then multiply it by the probability of like the related state of the world. So I'll just give an example from the Many-gods Objection to illustrate this. So let's say you're presented with the basic 2x2, believe in God, not believe in God, God exists, God doesn't exist. And then you're like, well, there's Christianity and Islam, which one should I pick? The way that the Many-gods Objection is often framed, if you're doing it from this infinity decision theory perspective, is to say, well, look, take the probability of Islam, multiply that by the infinite good of the Muslim heaven, it's infinite, right? Take the probability of Christianity, multiply that by the infinite good of the Christian heaven, it's infinite. But because if you're a Christian and Islam's true, you don't get the reward, and if you're a Muslim and Christianity is true, you don't get the reward, then the problem becomes, well, look, Christianity and Islam look equal, but they're mutually exclusive. They're both infinitely good. You just take the probability and multiply it by infinity. But when it comes to decision theory, it doesn't really tell us how we can pick between them. And actually, you can raise even more complicated technical objections. I won't go into it here, but it's called the mixed strategies objection. And infinities actually just break down decision theory completely, and they basically say we can't make any decision because there's always this chance of getting infinite utility, and even if it's astronomically small, probability times utility, infinite. And this is why what I said earlier I think is so important, which is that probability has to matter. And so to take actually a thought experiment in some ways similar to the one Tyler gave earlier, I like to give one where there's 2 doors. Behind each door, there's some chance at getting infinite utility. Behind door number 1, it's a 90% chance, and behind door number 2, it's a 10% chance. And if you're just like, hey, probability times utility, 0.9 times infinity, 0.1 times infinity, like, again, you're gonna have to flip a coin to pick which door to choose. Or like, if I give you $1 to pick the 10% door, you should pick the 10% door, And it's like, that is clearly the wrong result. So this things do get technical with this, because what you have to do is you have to find a way to compare infinities that doesn't rely on this idea, like that makes the probability matter. So you end up kind of having different kinds of infinities or even different sizes of infinities, but those are a thing mathematically, by the way. We won't go into all of that. But 0.9 chance of infinity should be better than 0.1 chance of infinity. So the kind of big upshot of the paper is that the probability of getting infinite utility matters, and for that reason, you should wager on the religion you take to be most probable, which is the same thing that I said in response to the Many-gods Objection. But it does, I admit, it does kind of get technical and complicated. So if you want to look at the paper that me and my friend Andy wrote, it's called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, and we sort of propose using limits and ratios to solve this problem. But there are other solutions as well. And actually, Mike Rhoda has a book. It's called Taking Pascal's Wager. And in that book, he actually just makes a version of the wager that's only relying on finite values. So he sort of just pushes infinities aside. I think the downside of this version of the wager is that there's going to be some threshold at which the religion has to meet some threshold for you to wager, for it to be rational for you to wager. And what that threshold is going to depend on what the finite values in question are. So the cool thing about the infinite version is that you don't have to commit to such a threshold. But the nice thing about Mike's version is it sidesteps all these technical problems that come up with infinities. So I think you can go either way. I like the infinite version just because it is stronger, but I totally acknowledge that some people get weirded out by infinities, and then I'm like, yay, Mike, let's do the finite version. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's actually what we ended up doing too, just taking the Rhoda approach and sidestepping the infinite utilities, because it was so hard once you plug those in there to deal with that. But you guys did a great job. We'll attach the paper when we push this out. So Megan, not only do you apply Pascal's wager practically, but you've actually you're doing some work on it. Can you take us through sort of what work you're doing now that relates to Pascal's wager?
Yeah, so I have a short paper should be coming out in the Australasian Philosophical Review in response to another paper by Catherine Dormandy on evidentialism about faith. So in that paper, Catherine Dormandy defends an evidentialist account of faith against what she calls partialist accounts of faith, which she defines as the idea that one good making feature of faith is that it kind of ignores negative evidence against the object of faith, or at least assigns it very little importance. So she presents these two options, partialism and evidentialism, where evidentialism is just following the evidence wherever it might lead. So in my paper, I kind of, I draw attention to Pascal because I think he makes us aware of situations that don't fit in either one of these boxes, situations that evidence can't speak to. And in the paper, I compare Pascal's idea of religious faith, this idea that, well, evidence can't get us all the way to, I should believe or I shouldn't believe. But what can get us to I should believe or I shouldn't believe is this practical engagement with the object of faith. Like Tyler said, when you were quoting Ice Cube, going to church, taking the Mass, engaging in prayer, this kind of thing. He said, and belief will arise from that. And was brought up earlier that the first concern is, aside from just sort of skepticism at the possibility of doxastic voluntarism, probably most people acknowledge that there is some kind of indirect voluntarism. We can exercise some sense of indirect control over our beliefs, but the concern that comes up later is is, well, as you know, this seems irrational. It seems like this is violating some kind of norm of belief. So I think it's important first to note that Pascal thinks that it's not like, well, should I wager or not wager? He thinks you can't avoid wagering. Everybody. It's not. It's not a matter of should I wager or not. It's just we need to be aware that everybody wagers, and based on that, how should we wager? So this is sort of the same approach that William James takes when he's responding to Clifford's ethics of belief. He says, well, Clifford, you ignore this whole class of things where you can't, you have to make a choice. It's sort of an epistemic choice, but you can't make this based on evidence. You can't avoid making the choice. So this is how Pascal presents the situation that the individual finds himself in with respect to religious faith, a kind of thing that it's an epistemic choice we have to make that's underdetermined by the evidence, that where reason can't get us there. So what are we going to do? Or reason can't get us there directly via evidence. And I think there's like a whole class of things that are like this. So there's been a lot of, in my paper, I talk about the recent literature on transformative experiences. So Lori Paul is the person really writing on this right now. The example she uses a lot is the transformative experience of having children. So I've heard, I don't have children yet, but what I've heard is that you really don't know what it's like having children until you have children. It doesn't really matter how much time you spend around other people's children, reading about what it's like to have children. You just really do not know until you have them yourself. And so, a concern that was raised for maybe popular ideas of like decision theory is, well, then how can people make the decision to have children rationally? And, Paul writes, I mean, this is an oversimplification of what she writes, but that it's not that you can't come at this from an evidentialist perspective. You just have to kind of do it or not do it. And this is a choice that you make kind of without any kind of evidence. And so I compare this to how Pascal talks about religious faith in the pensées. That there's a kind of evidence that we can access only after deciding to engage in faith. I do in the paper write that I don't that there's another kind of attitude that we exercise before we get belief, which is acceptance. We have to accept these propositions. And by that, I just mean something really pragmatic, just acting as though this thing is true because we think this proposition is pursuit worthy for some reason. So before we have this doxastic attitudes about the object of faith, we first have these other kind of more pragmatic epistemic attitudes. And then, as Pascal argues, if we're right, then this kind of transformative evidence will reveal itself to us on the other side.
That's great. I mean, that's really interesting. I have so many questions, but I'll go ahead and land the plane. But before we go, I'd love to hear from both Megan and Liz on your thoughts for someone who isn't a Christian but is sympathetic to the view and what we've been considering. What are maybe some advice or some wisdom you could share with somebody, again, who's a non-Christian but is motivated by this Pascalian sort of reasoning? Can we start with you, Megan?
Oh, gonna start with me. Okay. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're intrigued by Pascal's reasoning, if you find Christianity appealing, but you don't know if you think it's true. I mean, I think that take the wager in the direction he suggests. Engage in Christianity as though it's true. This is the thing I had to really work on in myself. Don't stress out if you don't feel like you believe it, especially not right away. For me, it's like this is maybe occurs every other day. You have to kind of calm down. I think there's a really intuitive reflex to once you feel doubt about it or disbelief about it, there's this intuitive reflex to pull back, to pull out, to leave, to stop doing these things. So I would say don't. Think of it pragmatically. Think of it like a practice, like a kind of, dance that you're trying to get good at. And see what happens from there once you really, really give it a shot in that way.
That's a fantastic analogy. Dance you're trying to get good at. I love it. That's great. Liz?
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And I think basically what I'm going to say is just going to add to that. But I think the biggest point that I wanted to press here is that realizing that the rationality of Christian belief is not the same as the rationality of Christian commitment. And I think a lot of times it's easy to conflate those. And it's basically just what Megan said. You're like, I have doubts. I don't know what to do with these doubts. Like, why would God allow evil? Like, why does God seem hidden, etc. And I've heard it called the path from doubt to getting out. And they just say, I have doubts. I don't know if I can believe. I'm out. Peace. And like people will, like, this happens to a lot of college students, but it happens to people, like lots of different people. And they'll just say, I don't know what to do with this. So I don't think I can in good faith be a Christian anymore. And I just don't think that's true. I think you can rationally be committed to Christianity, even if you think, the evidence is below whatever that threshold is for belief. And that's because of how good it would be if you continued in this commitment and God did in fact exist, a God that was personal and wanted a relationship with you especially. And so I would encourage people just to think about that possibility. Like, what if there is a God? And what if that God is personal and wants to have a relationship with you? Wouldn't it be good if you pursued that God? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And I have a paper where I actually, it's a recent paper. It's called Belief, Faith, and Hope. And what I argue is that belief can underlie our commitments, but so can faith and so can hope. And so I think that having faith that God exists, even if that doesn't include believing that God exists, and even that hoping that God exists, both of those can actually underlie and make rational a Christian commitment. So it's not just about belief. And I feel like in the church today, people just are obsessed with belief. And what does James say? Like, even demons believe and shudder. Like, it's not just about belief. And it's really easy to make it all about belief. So I think commitment is a lot more important than like certainty that God exists. And I think God wants commitment more than God wants us to just like be certain and never have doubts and just to like push doubts away. So what I think is cool about Pascal's wager and kind of this idea of acceptance, like acting as if God exists, is that they can show that we can take our doubts seriously. We can follow the evidence. We don't have to just like put our head in the sand, but we don't have to give up our commitment to Christianity or to God. So I think that's really great about this whole topic. So basically I just agree with Megan.
That's fantastic.
So in summary, Pascal's wager doesn't assume doxastic voluntarism. The many-gods objections can be dealt with, right, by upping probabilities for specific religious traditions. And the whole utility, infinite utility concern can be sidestepped if you go the Mike Rutter route.
I like to just think about it as, think about how good the outcome would be if God existed and you pursued that relationship with God. And there's non-religious cases of this too, not to drag our discussion out too long, but it's like, if your brother goes missing and he's been missing for a super long time and the probability that he's dead is like 0.2 or 0.1, like think about how good the outcome would be is if you continued to search for him, as if you act as if he wasn't dead, and he wasn't, you know what I mean? And think about how much you would regret it if he was still alive and you stopped searching. So you can think about, I mean, there's non-religious cases of this too. This isn't just a religious thing. This isn't just like special pleading for God. It's true that in general, when the stakes are really high, it can be rational to act as if something's true, even if you don't believe it. So that's the way I like to put it. But yes, I think that was a great summary, Tyler. And I just like talking about this. So you should.
Yeah, it's been an awesome discussion. And Mike, someone should apply this to climate change. I'm just saying, throwing that out there.
Yeah.
It's been great having y'all on. And any last comments or anything else you wanted to get in before we end the discussion?
I actually do have a last comment, and this is sort of, I thought of this when Liz was saying the last thing she was saying. I think this is why it's actually really important that philosophers of religion focus not just really on these sort of proofs for God, but on really making the case that it would actually be good. if this particular God existed. I'm not sure there's as much good work on this as I would like to see out there. Oh, there probably is. I just haven't read it. Maybe it's not as popular, but I think that's super important, possibly even more important than the other stuff. I mean, we definitely do gamble all the time. We do wager all the time in favor of the things we really love and wish were true. And so I think possibly the objection we could raise is just that actually wouldn't be that good. It wouldn't be that good if this God existed. So it'd be cool if some people should take up that task. Yeah.
Can I add something really quick too? So I love that. And actually one of my colleagues, Class Cray, is working on this right now. So he
Really?
has, I think I should double check, but I think it's a book with Cambridge University Press, and I think it's called The Axiology of Theism. So it's basically like, the question is, should we want God to exist? And my friend Jordan Hampton has a YouTube channel called Crash Course Apologetics, and he actually just did an interview with class on this topic that, like, he literally did the interview last week. So it's super new. I don't think it's out yet, but it should be out in the next couple weeks. But Megan's totally right that, like, this is way, 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 way less explored than, like, all these arguments for and against God's existence and problem of evil stuff and all that. But it is cool that people are working on it, and it's actually something I would like to work on a little bit more as well. But I think it's a really interesting topic and very distinct from, like, is the ontological argument sound, you know? So
it's great. It's so practical. I love it. And it's just so cool. And you guys have really done a great job drawing that out today. So Megan and Liz, we really appreciate your time. We're going to have to do this again. I can't thank you enough for coming on today and for laying this out for everybody. I really appreciate it. And good luck with everything moving forward.
thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.